I'm Kinsley Sinclair, and I was 34 the morning my family drove 3 hours to sell a ranch they didn't know I already owned. But this story really starts 9 years before that, on my 25th birthday, with a phone call from my mother. She was telling me they couldn't make it. Again. My whole life, I was the strong one. My sister Sloane was the one who needed them. That birthday, I finally believed it. So I packed a bag and I left for good. What I did the morning of that birthday, and the 8 years I spent rebuilding a half-dead ranch 3 hours from anyone who shared my last name, is the part none of them ever saw coming. Welcome back to Calm Drama Stories, where ordinary people set hard boundaries and quietly come out ahead. If a story like this finds you tonight, you're exactly where you should be. Drop a comment and subscribe so the next one reaches you too. These days, my mornings start at 4:30, in the dark, with frost on the fence rails and 40 horses waiting on me. I run a boarding and training operation out in the eastern hills, 200 acres, a rescue program on the back 40, and a waiting list 11 names deep. People drive past the sign and assume I inherited all of it. I didn't. I built it with 2 hands and a borrowed truck, and a stubbornness that scared most men off. Casey, my apprentice, is 19 and already better with a nervous yearling than I was at 30. She showed up that morning with 2 coffees and a question about a colicky gelding. I checked him, walked him, told her he'd be fine by noon. Then I pulled my grandfather's gloves off the post by the tack room, the cracked brown leather ones, worn soft at the knuckles, and I laced them on like I do every single day. They don't fit me right. I keep them anyway. There's a whole life folded into that leather, and I'll get to it. Because 8 years ago, I had none of this. I had a duffel bag, a quarter tank of gas, and my mother's voice still ringing in my ear. "You're the strong one," she'd said, like it was a gift. I used to think being the strong one meant being loved differently. It took me years to understand it just meant being loved less, and being expected to say thank you. So let me take you back to the kitchen where I learned that. The week of my 25th birthday, before I knew a single thing about deeds or horses or the difference between family and the people who simply show up. Back then, I lived in a rented room across town and worked at a feed and supply store, saving for a vet tech program. My family was 3 exits up the highway in the house I grew up in. My mother, Sharon, ran that house like a triage ward, and Sloane was always the patient. My father, Wade, kept the peace by agreeing with whoever spoke last, which was always Sharon. And Sloane, 2 years younger, had a gift. She could turn any ordinary Tuesday into an emergency that required everyone's hands. A bad date became a breakdown. A parking ticket became a crisis of confidence. I learned the rhythm of it young, the way you learn weather. When the air in that kitchen got heavy, somebody's plans were about to get canceled, and it was never going to be Sloane's. I'd brought it up once, gently, the spring before. "It feels like there's only ever room for one of us," I said. My mother didn't even look up from the stove. "Sloane's more delicate, honey. You know that." I did know that. I'd been told it so many times it felt less like a description and more like a sentence handed down at birth. The strong one, the capable one, the one who'd be fine. Nobody ever asked if I wanted to be fine. They just decided I was, and built the whole house around it. That spring, I told myself the next milestone would be different. I'd pay for it myself. I'd plan it small. I'd give them no reason and no excuse. I really believed that would be enough. It's almost funny now, how much I still believed in them that year. Almost. If you want to know exactly what I was up against, picture my college graduation 2 years earlier. Associates in animal science, first in my family to finish anything past high school, and I'd worked nights for it. The ceremony was at 10 in the morning. At 9:15, Sloane fainted in the parking lot. Or said she did. By the time the paramedics shrugged and left, my family was gathered around her in the car, and I was walking across that stage alone, scanning a crowd of strangers for faces that weren't there. They made it for the last 10 minutes. My mother took a photo of Sloane recovering and posted it before she took one of me in my cap. I know because I saw it in the family group chat that night. The one labeled Sinclair Fam. The one I was technically a member of and functionally invisible in. 41 messages about Sloane's scare. 2 about my degree. Both thumbs up emojis. I muted it after that. I didn't leave it. I want you to notice that, because it matters later. I stayed in that chat, half listening, the way you keep a hand on a stove to remember it's hot. People always ask why scapegoats don't just walk away sooner. Here's the honest answer. You keep waiting for the one day they finally see you. You're sure it's coming. You've got proof saved up of all the times it almost did. And every almost is a hook in your mouth. By 25, I had a lot of almosts. I had no idea I was 2 weeks from the one that would finally cut the line. So I planned my 25th carefully, like diffusing something. I booked a back room at a steakhouse in town, 8 seats, and I put down $100 deposit out of my own savings. I didn't ask anyone to pay. I didn't ask anyone to plan. All I asked was that they show up on a Saturday at 7. I drove to the house on a Tuesday to tell them in person, because texting felt too easy to ignore. My mother was at the table with her checkbook and a stack of Sloane's bills. "It's my birthday Saturday," I said. "Just dinner. I've got it handled." She nodded the way you nod at a coworker. My father said it sounded nice. And then, because I'd learned to read that kitchen, I asked the question straight out. "Is anything going on Saturday I should know about?" My mother capped her pen. "We can only show up for one of you at a time, Kinsley. You understand?" I didn't understand. I never had. But I said yes anyway, because saying no had never once changed the outcome and had always cost me more. I drove back to my rented room and told myself the deposit guaranteed something. A reserved table, a confirmed plan, a reason for them to come. I actually slept well that week. I let myself imagine 8 chairs full and a small cake, and my mother, just once, lifting a glass to me. That's the part I'm least proud of. Not the hoping, the certainty. I was so sure the deposit had bought me a fair fight. I should have known by then that the house always changes the rules right before you win. The first text came Thursday. Sloane in the group chat, all lowercase. "Feeling really off lately? Scared." My mother responded in 90 seconds. I'd never once gotten a 90-second response. By Friday afternoon, feeling off had become a full episode, and there was suddenly a new detail. Sloane's boyfriend had proposed, and they wanted to throw an engagement dinner. Saturday. At 7. The exact slot I'd reserved a month before. I want to be clear about what I did, because I've replayed it 1,000 times. I didn't sulk. I called my sister directly. "Sloane," I said, "that's my birthday dinner time. You know that." There was a pause, and then the smallest, softest voice. "I didn't realize. I'm just so anxious, Kins. Can't we combine them?" Combine them. My 25th birthday folded into her engagement party like a napkin under a plate. I told her no, calmly, and I called my mother next and laid it out plainly. Same restaurant chains, different night, easy fix. My mother listened, and then she said, the thing that told me Saturday was already lost. "Sloane's in a fragile place right now. Can't you be flexible? You're so good at that." Flexible. The strong one's other name. I hung up and sat on the edge of my bed and did the math I'd refused to do for 25 years. I added up every canceled thing, every almost, every 90-second response that was never for me. And for the first time, the total didn't make me sad. It made me very, very calm. Because Saturday wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a pattern with a date on it. And I finally understood that the only way to stop losing the game was to stop sitting at the table. The official call came Saturday at noon, 7 hours before my reservation. My mother's voice was warm and rehearsed. "Honey, we're going to do Sloane's engagement thing tonight. We knew you'd be okay with it. We'll celebrate you another time, I promise." Another time. The promise that never has a date. I stood in my little kitchen with the phone against my ear and watched a square of afternoon light crawl across the floor, and I asked the only thing left to ask. "Why is it always me, Mom?" And she said it. Not cruelly. That's the part people never believe. She said it gently, like she was explaining something obvious to a slow child. You're the strong one, Kinsley. Sloane's the one who needs us. There it was. The whole architecture of my childhood in 11 words. I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I said okay, and I meant a different okay than she heard. I called the steakhouse and canceled my own table and let them keep the deposit. Then I pulled my duffel bag from the closet and started putting things in it. Slowly. The way you pack, when you already know you're not coming back. 2 pairs of jeans. My work boots. The little cash box from under my bed. I didn't have a plan. Exactly. I had a direction. 3 hours east, past the last gas station, there was a man who had never once canceled on me in 25 years, even when it would have been easier to. My grandfather Earl. My mother's own father, the one she'd quietly written off as a stubborn old failure on a dying piece of land. I got in my car at 4 o'clock with the tank a quarter full and my whole life in the back seat. And I drove toward the only person who'd ever shown up. It was a long drive, and somewhere around the second hour the shaking started. Not from sadness, but from something letting go. I called Earl from a gas station outside the county line. He picked up on the second ring, which is its own kind of love when you're used to 90-second waits that never come. Grandpa, it's Kinsley. Can I come stay a while? No questions, no why. Just, doors unlocked. There's stew on the stove. I hung up and stood in the cold under the gas station lights and let myself feel, for the first time, how tired I was of auditioning. I'd spent 25 years trying to be valuable enough to keep. And the one person who'd never made me audition lived on a ranch my own mother was ashamed of. I pulled into Earl's place a little after midnight. The headlights swept across a sagging barn, a fence missing half its rails, and a porch light he'd left on for me. He was sitting on the steps in a flannel coat, 71 years old, with a thermos and an extra mug. He didn't hug me. He just patted the step beside him and said, "Rough birthday?" And something in the plainness of it broke me open clean. I sat down. I told him everything. The deposit, the engagement, the 11 words. He listened the whole way through without interrupting once, which was its own miracle. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the dark shapes of his horses. Then he said something I didn't understand for years. "Sharon learned the wrong lesson a long time ago," he said. "But the land doesn't care who your mother loves. Land only cares who works it." I had no idea yet that he was already telling me everything. I woke the next morning to the smell of coffee and the sound of a man who'd been up for 3 hours pretending he hadn't. Earl's ranch was worse than it looked at midnight. 80 acres he could no longer work alone, 6 aging horses, a barn with a bad roof, and fences a strong wind could have finished. He'd been running it into the ground out of pure pride, refusing to sell, refusing to ask Sharon for help. She'd have charged him interest on anyway. Over eggs, he laid it out like a business proposition, not charity, which is the only reason I could accept it. "I've got land and no body," he said. "You've got a body and no land." Seems simple. Then he stood, walked to a hook by the door and tossed me a pair of work gloves. Cracked brown leather, soft at the knuckles, 2 sizes too big. "These were my father's," he said. "They'll fit when you've earned them." I thought it was a figure of speech. I pulled them on and went out to fix a fence I didn't know how to fix, and I cut my hands raw inside that old leather by noon. That first week nearly broke me. I'd never built anything in my life that wasn't a savings account. But there's a thing that happens when you work land. It doesn't lie to you. A post you set right stays standing. A horse you feed comes back to the gate. For the first time, effort and reward lined up in a straight line, with no mother in between to redirect the credit. I called no one. I didn't tell my family where I'd gone. And in the silence of all those unsent texts, I started, very slowly, to hear my own thoughts for the first time. June showed up in March, in a stock trailer that smelled like neglect. A neighbor had found her standing in a foreclosed lot, A bay mare so starved you could have hung a hat on her hip bones, ribs like a xylophone, eyes flat and gone. Nobody wanted her. The vet quoted a number to bring her back and said honestly it might not take. Earl looked at me. I looked at the mare. We can't afford her, I said. We can't afford to leave her either, he answered and walked off to get the halter. I named her June because that's the month I figured she'd either turn the corner or she wouldn't. I learned more about patience from that mare than from any human in my life. You can't rush a starved horse back. Feed her too much too fast and you'll kill her with kindness, her body too wrecked to handle the very thing she needs. So you go slow. Small meals. 6 times a day. For months. You earn an ounce of trust at a time. I'd sit in her stall after dark, not touching her, just being there, the way Earl had patted the step beside him. And somewhere in those nights I understood that I'd been the mare for 25 years, starved at a full table. Told I wasn't hungry, because I'd learned not to ask. June flinched every time I raised my hand, even to scratch her neck, and I knew that flinch from the inside. The first morning she walked to the gate to meet me instead of waiting in the corner, I sat down in the mud and cried like the day was ending. It wasn't. It was the first real morning of the rest of my life. I just didn't have the words for that yet. Here's the flaw I brought with me, the one no childhood beats out of you for free. I could not, for the life of me, accept help. I'd been the strong one so long that needing anything felt like handing someone a weapon. So I worked. I worked until my hands split and my back seized and I fell asleep in my boots. When a neighbor offered to bring his tractor for the south field, I told him I had it. I didn't have it. I had blisters and a shovel, and a point to prove to people who weren't watching. Earl caught on fast. One evening, he found me trying to right a fence post alone in the dark, soaked through, shaking. He didn't help me. He just leaned on the rail and watched until I gave up. You think being strong means doing it alone, he said. That's not strength, Kinsley. That's just the same cage with nicer scenery. I told him I was fine. The strong one's 2 favorite words. He shook his head slow. Your mother told you that you don't need anybody, and now you're proving her right out of spite. Who's that for? I didn't have an answer. I went to bed angry, which is usually the sound of someone being right about you. The next morning, I called the neighbor and asked about the tractor. It cost me something to dial, more than the work would have cost my body. But the field got done in a day, and the man stayed for coffee. And I learned that letting someone in didn't drain the well. It filled it. Sharon had built me to run on empty and call it independence. Out here, slowly, I was learning the difference between standing on my own and standing entirely alone. They are not the same thing. Nobody ever told me that. If you've ever been called the strong one until it became an excuse to leave you out, you already know exactly how heavy that duffel bag felt going into my car. Stay with me. The part that changed everything is coming. And if this is hitting home, hit subscribe so the ending finds you too. Because by the end of that first year, things started to turn. Our first boarding client was a woman named Dell, who kept a retired barrel horse and paid on time and told 2 friends. Then those friends told friends. I'd grown up watching my mother ration love like it was a scarce resource, and out here I discovered the opposite was true of good work. Do it once, do it right, and it multiplies. June was rideable by fall, glossy and round, the flat gone out of her eyes. People who'd seen her come off that trailer started bringing me their hard cases, the biters and the bolters and the ones the trainer down the road gave up on. I was good at them. Of course I was. I'd spent my whole life studying how a creature learns to expect the worst, and how, sometimes, with enough slow proof, it learns to expect something better. Earl started introducing me around town as my granddaughter who runs the place, and the first time he said it, I had to turn and pretend to check a latch so he wouldn't see my face. Runs the place. Not visits. Not helps. Runs. I was 26. My hands were ruined. I was bone-tired most nights, and I was happier than I'd ever been in my mother's house. The horses didn't care if I was delicate. The fence didn't care if I was the favorite. Out here, for the first time, I got exactly what I earned. No more, and no less. And it turned out that was all I'd ever wanted. The first call from home came 18 months after I left. Not to find me, to use me. My mother's number lit up my phone one Sunday while I was worming yearlings, and I almost let it ring out. I answered because 18 months is long enough for hope to grow back like a weed. "Kinsley," she said, warm as a salesman, "we've missed you." Then, in the next breath, before I could even respond to that, the ask. Sloane was behind on a car payment. The wedding had fallen through, the fiancé gone, and she was struggling. And could I maybe send something to help my sister get back on her feet? I stood in the barn aisle holding a tube of dewormer, and I waited for the old pull. The one that used to make me empty my account for people who'd never empty a chair for me. It didn't come. Something had healed over while I wasn't looking. "How did you get my number?" I asked, because I'd changed it. A pause. "Sloane found you online. The ranch has a website now." So that's what we were. Not a daughter they'd lost. A line item they'd located. I told my mother I wasn't able to help, which was a lie I felt no guilt about, and I asked her not to call again about money. She got sharp then. Fast. The warmth gone. "After everything this family did for you," she started, and I hung up before she could finish a sentence I'd heard 10,000 times. I went back to my yearlings, but I noticed something cold settle in afterward, a question I couldn't shake. They knew where I was now. They knew the ranch was real. And my mother had asked, very casually, right before the money, how Grandpa Earl was doing these days. The text from my cousin Maddie came on a Tuesday in early spring, 2 years and some months after I'd left. Maddie was the only one in the family who'd ever treated me like a person, and she sent 3 words first. "You should see this." Then a screenshot. It was from the Sinclair fam group chat, the one I was still technically in, but had been quietly removed from a week before without a single goodbye. They'd made a second chat. One without me. And Maddie, bless her, had been added to it by mistake. I sat down on a hay bale and read it twice to make sure I understood. My mother had written, "When Dad passes, the land's worth real money now that someone fixed it up. We split it 3 ways and sell. Kinsley can keep a horse or 2 if she's reasonable about it. A horse or 2, if I'm reasonable." After 2 years of dawn-to-dark labor that had turned 80 dead acres into something worth selling, my own family had already divided the proceeds in a chat they'd built specifically to keep me out of. Sloane had replied with a heart emoji. My father had written, "Sounds fair." Sounds fair. I read those 2 words a dozen times. I want to tell you I raged. I didn't. I'd done my raging in installments over 27 years and I was all out. What I felt instead was a strange, clarifying cold, the same calm that had settled in on my birthday. They weren't going to change. I'd known that. But now I knew something sharper. They were already counting money built on my back, and they were so sure of it they'd written it down. I screenshotted Maddie's screenshot, saved it, and went to find my grandfather. I found Earl in the tack room, oiling a bridle, and I showed him the screenshot because I'd stopped hiding things from him a long time ago. He read it slow. His jaw worked. Then he set the bridle down and looked at me with an expression I'd never seen on him. Something between grief and grim humor. "Well," he said, "that's my daughter, all right." He didn't defend her. That's a thing I'll always be grateful for. He just took it in, the full weight of it, and let it be true. Then he said something that landed soft and didn't fully register. "They're planning to sell what they think is mine," he said. "Let 'em plan." I asked what he meant. He just patted my shoulder and said, "One day this place should be yours, Kinsley. You're the only one who ever bled for it." I brushed it off. People say things like that. Sentimental things, by lamplight, that don't survive daybreak. I'd learned not to bank on words from anyone with the last name Sinclair, and Earl, for all his goodness, was still a Sinclair. So I filed it under kindness and went back to work. What I did do was decide something for myself. I was done waiting to be chosen, and I was done bracing to be discarded. If the land was going to come to me, fine. If it wasn't, also fine. Either way, I was going to build it so high and so good that no three-way split could ever erase what I'd made. That night, I drew up a real business plan at the kitchen table, the first one of my life. Boarding, training, a rescue arm, lessons. I gave myself 5 years. I beat it in 3. The next 3 years are the part nobody posts about, because hard work doesn't make good photos. I took out a small operating loan in my own name, terrifying and freeing in equal measure, and I poured it into a new barn roof and a covered arena. I got my certifications, one weekend course at a time, until the wall by my desk had more letters after my name than my mother ever believed I'd earn. The boarding stalls filled. The waiting list started. I hired a part-time hand, then a full-time one. And June, my throwaway mare, the one nobody wanted off that trailer, turned out to carry bloodlines worth more than the truck I'd driven therein. Her first foal sold for $11,000 to a show barn 2 states over. I kept the second. I framed the bill of sale and hung it next to my certifications, not for the money, but for the proof. The unwanted one had become the cornerstone. I knew the feeling. Somewhere in year 5 after leaving, I stopped checking whether I was happy and just noticed, one ordinary evening, leaning on the arena rail with a cup of coffee, that I already was. I'd built a life so full it had no empty chair for anyone to refuse to fill. I had Casey, who'd come to me at 17 with nowhere else to go and stayed. I had Dell and the boarders who'd become friends. I had a vet named Tom Reyes who started finding reasons to stop by between calls, and who looked at me like I was something rare instead of something durable. And I had Earl, slower now, mostly supervising from a folding chair in the shade, but still there every morning, still calling me the woman who runs the place. I thought we had years left like that. I was wrong about the timeline, the way you always are with the people you assume will outlast the work. The first sign came on a cold morning in the 7th year, when Earl couldn't get up from his chair. It was his heart. The doctors used careful words, but the gist was plain. He'd had a quiet event, the kind that's a warning the first time and a sentence the second. He came home from the hospital on a Thursday, smaller in the chair than he'd been on Monday, and I rearranged my whole operation to be close to the house. What I didn't expect was how fast the news traveled. 3 days after Earl came home, my mother called. Not me, at first. She called the hospital, then the neighbors, then finally me, fishing for details under a thin coat of concern. "We just want to be there for Dad," she said. We. The same we that hadn't driven 3 hours in 7 years. Suddenly the family that had written "Sounds Fair" about selling his land couldn't wait to visit his bedside. I'm not naive. I knew what the visit was about, and it wasn't about Earl's heart. It was about Earl's estate. A dying man on valuable land is a different proposition than a stubborn old failure, and my mother had always known the price of everything. I told her she could come. I want you to understand why. It wasn't weakness. It was that Earl, propped up in his chair, had heard me on the phone, and he'd said one quiet thing. "Let them come, Kinsley. Let them show their whole hand. It's easier to deal with people once you've seen all their cards." So I set a date. I made up the guest rooms, and I stood at the kitchen window the morning they were due, watching the long gravel drive, my grandfather's gloves on my hands, and I felt the old childhood bracing creep back into my shoulders. Then I made myself stop. This wasn't their house anymore. It was mine to host in, and I'd learned, finally, the difference. They drove up in my mother's spotless sedan, the 3 of them. And the first thing Sharon did when she stepped out was look at the land instead of the house where her father lay sick. I watched her do the math. The new arena, the full barn, the trucks and trailers with the ranch logo on the doors. I saw her eyes move across 200 acres of restored value, and I saw her recalculate the split in real time. Sloane got out next, 32 now, still moving like the world owed her a soft landing, and she swept toward me with open arms. "Kinsley, look at you, all rugged." She hugged me. I let her. My father came last, hung back, gave me a nod that tried to be apology and didn't have the spine for it. They went in to see Earl and they performed concern beautifully for about 20 minutes. Then the questions started, gentle as picking a lock. How much land was it exactly? Was the business turning a profit? Had Dad updated any of his paperwork lately? What with his health? Sharon asked it all in the voice you use for the dying, and Earl, propped on his pillows, answered every question with the same 2 words. Ask Kinsley. It drove her quietly insane. She'd come to assess an inheritance and kept being redirected to the daughter she'd discarded. At dinner, she tried a new angle. We've all been so worried about you out here alone, sweetheart. Alone. As if I hadn't built a whole life she could see through the window. I just smiled and passed the potatoes and said I'd never felt less alone. And under the table, my hands in my lap, I felt how steady they were. No shake. No brace. For the first time in my life, sitting at a table with my family, I wasn't waiting for the floor to drop. They left after 2 days, having learned nothing concrete and assuming everything. Here's what they assumed. That the land was Earl's. That when he died it would pass through his will. 3 ways. The way my mother had already divided it in a chat. That I was a tenant with calluses, a caretaker who'd done them all a favor by raising the property value before the sale. What they didn't bother to learn, because they'd never once thought I was worth learning, is what Earl told me the night after they pulled out of the drive. He had me sit at the kitchen table, and he slid a manila folder across the wood. Inside was a deed. The land, the buildings, the water rights, all of it, transferred into my name. Recorded at the county courthouse. Dated 3 years earlier. I did it the year after that screenshot, he said. Walked into the county office myself. Signed it over. Paid the fee. It's done. It's been done. You don't owe a sale to anybody. I stared at the county stamp and felt the floor of my whole life shift. Not because of the money, because somebody had chosen me. On paper. Permanently. Where it couldn't be taken back by a softer voice or a fresher crisis. Why didn't you tell me? I asked. He almost smiled. Because you needed to build it like it was already yours and earn it like it wasn't. Look what you did. Then he got serious. Don't tell Sharon. Let her keep planning her split. The day she finds out it was never hers to split, she'll show you exactly who she is. And you'll be standing on solid ground when she does. I put the folder in the safe. I didn't say a word to anyone, and I went back to work on land that, it turned out, had been mine the whole time. Quick thing before the hard part. Notice that I never raised my voice once through any of this. That's not weakness. That's a woman who finally stopped auditioning for love. If that idea means something to you, leave a comment with one boundary you wish you'd set sooner. I read every one of them. Now, the hard part. As Earl's health slipped that spring, Sloane made her move, and it was straight out of the old playbook. She started calling Earl directly, sweet and tearful, with a brand new crisis. She was being evicted, she said. She had nowhere to go. Couldn't her dear grandfather help her? Maybe with a little something now? Maybe with a mention in his will? Just so she'd know she was loved before he passed. I only found out because Earl told me, shaking his head over his coffee. Your sister thinks I'm dying stupid, he said. He'd told her no. Flat. The same word that had never been available to me as a child was, it turned out, perfectly available when an old man decided to use it. Sloane escalated. The calls came daily. Then Sharon joined in, framing it as family unity, suggesting Earl do right by all his grandchildren while he still could. They had no idea the deed was already recorded. They were lobbying for a vote in an election that was over. Earl let them keep at it, the way he'd told me to, gathering their whole hand. But it cost him. I'd watch him hang up the phone gray and tired, and I'd want to tear into them, and he'd just pat my hand and say, Soon, Kinsley, let them write it all down. They were writing it all down, in texts, in voicemails, in a paper trail of greed they were too sure of themselves to hide. They thought they were closing in. They were only making my case. Earl went downhill over 6 weeks, the way strong men do, all at once after a long, stubborn plateau. I moved a bed into the front room so he could see the horses through the window. I cut my client load in half and learned to do the things you learn to do for someone you love who's leaving. I'm not going to dress it up or ring it out. It was hard and it was holy and it was mostly quiet. Tom came by most evenings, off the clock, and sat with us, and never once made it about himself. Casey took over the morning chores without being asked. The life I'd built, the one my family thought made me selfish for leaving them, turned out to be exactly the net that held us all up when it mattered. Earl mostly slept those last weeks, but he had good hours, and in one of them he asked me to help him out to the fence line one more time. I walked him slow, his arm thin through the flannel, out to the rail where the gloves hung on the post. He took them down, the cracked brown leather, his father's gloves, the ones he'd told me would fit when I'd earned them. He pressed them into my hands. "They fit now," he said. They did. Somewhere in 7 years of work, my hands had grown into them, and I'd never noticed the day it happened. We stood at the rail and watched June graze in the low gold light, the throwaway mare, sleek and sound and exactly where she belonged. Earl didn't say anything profound. He just squeezed my shoulder once and said, "Good work, kid." 3 words. The richest I've ever been handed. He passed in his sleep 9 days later with the window open and the horses calling at dawn. I buried my grandfather on a clear Saturday in the little cemetery behind the country church he'd gone to for 60 years, and half the county came. Boarders, neighbors, the vet, the feed store owner, ranchers he'd helped and never mentioned. The man my mother had written off as a failure had a line of trucks parked a quarter-mile down the road. My family came too, of course. They wore black and dabbed their eyes and accepted condolences they hadn't earned, and I watched my mother work the crowd at her own father's funeral like it was a networking event. Sloane cried prettily and loudly, the way she did everything, and people who didn't know better comforted her. I stood at the graveside in my grandfather's gloves, dry-eyed, because I'd done my grieving in the front room over 6 honest weeks and had nothing performative left. After the burial, at the reception in the church hall, my mother found me by the coffee urn. She squeezed my arm and lowered her voice into the register she used for business. "We should all sit down soon, honey, about Dad's affairs, the land, the house. We'll need to settle it fairly, as a family." There it was, not even cold in the ground, as a family. The phrase that had only ever meant her plan, executed on schedule. I looked at her, this woman who had taught me I was strong so she'd never have to be soft with me, and I felt the last hook slip out of my mouth. "You're right," I said evenly. "Let's settle it. Come out to the ranch on Saturday. Bring whoever you need to." She smiled, mistaking my calm for compliance, the way she always had. "Wonderful. I'll bring the realtor." Of course she would. I just nodded and refilled my coffee. Saturday it was. She called twice that week to coordinate, and each call told me more about the plan she thought was hers. She'd already met with a realtor, a brisk woman named Paula, who specialized in agricultural acreage. She'd already gotten a rough valuation, sight unseen, based on what I'd told no one and she'd guessed from the road. 2 million, give or take, for the land and the operation as a going concern. She'd already decided the split. A third to her, a third to Sloane, a third to my father, which was really just a second third to her. And for me, the daughter who'd built every dollar of that going concern value, she'd prepared what she clearly thought was generous. "You can keep your personal horses, of course," she said on the phone, "and we'll make sure you get first option to rent the place from the new owners. Family helps family. Family helps family." I had to set the phone down and breathe, not from anger, from the sheer architectural beauty of her delusion. She'd canceled my birthday because I was the strong one who didn't need things. Now she was preparing to evict me from the life I'd built and framing it as a favor, and she could not conceive of a world in which it wasn't already hers to give away. "We can only show up for one of you," she'd told me at 25. At 34, she was about to learn the cost of a lifetime of that arithmetic. I said only, "See you Saturday, Mom." I didn't warn her. I didn't gloat. Earl had taught me better than that. You don't announce the reveal. You let people build the gallows themselves, in front of witnesses, and then you simply hand them the rope they brought. Saturday, my mother was bringing a realtor to sell my own land back to me. I let her. I spent that week deciding exactly how I wanted Saturday to go, because for once in my life I held all the cards and I wanted to play them with grace, not malice. I could have ambushed her at the front gate with the deed and a smirk. I didn't want that. I wanted the truth to land in daylight, in front of the people whose opinion she actually cared about, with no chance for her to revise it later into a story where she was the victim. So I made it a gathering. I called Earl's estate attorney, a soft-spoken man named Harlan who'd helped record the deed 3 years before, and I asked him to come Saturday and bring a certified copy. I invited a few of the boarders and neighbors who'd been at the funeral, framing it as a small memorial lunch for Earl out at the place he loved, which it also genuinely was. Tom would be there. Casey would be there. June would be in the near pasture, visible from the porch, the living proof of what this place had become. I wasn't building a trap. I was building a room where the truth couldn't be twisted because too many honest people would be standing in it. My weapon was never going to be volume or cruelty. My mother had spent 34 years wielding manipulation, lies, and the soft knife of who needs us more. I wasn't going to fight her with her own blade. I was going to fight her with a county stamp and a room full of witnesses. And I was going to do it without raising my voice one single time. That was the whole revenge. Not to hurt her. To simply, finally, be standing on ground she couldn't take, and let her break herself against the fact of it. Saturday came clear and bright. I put on Earl's gloves out of habit, then took them off and set them on the post, where he'd want them for this. They arrived at 11, and my mother had dressed for a closing. She came up the drive in heels that sank into the gravel, with Paula the realtor in tow carrying a leather folio, and Sloane and my father trailing behind. The memorial lunch was already underway on the wide porch and front lawn. Dell was there, and 3 other boarders, and 2 neighbors who'd known Earl 40 years, and Harlan the attorney in a quiet gray suit nobody had clocked as anything but a mourner. Tom stood by the steps. Casey leaned on the rail. June grazed 40 feet off in the near pasture, sleek and dark and impossible to miss. My mother surveyed it all with the satisfaction of a woman touring a property she's about to liquidate. She didn't come to grieve. She came to inventory. After a respectable 10 minutes of accepting sympathy, she clinked a fork against a glass, on my porch, at my grandfather's memorial, and called for everyone's attention like a hostess. "I just want to thank you all for loving my father," she began, warm and practiced. "This land meant everything to him, and I know he'd want it cared for properly now that he's gone." She let that settle. Then she delivered the line she'd driven 3 hours to say. "So our family has decided to sell the ranch, to good people who'll honor his legacy. Paula here will be handling it. And don't worry about Kinsley. She'll be well taken care of." She actually put a hand on Paula's shoulder, presenting the realtor like a gift. A murmur went through the porch, confused, because every person standing there knew exactly whose ranch this was, even if she didn't. I saw Dell's eyebrows climb. I saw a neighbor look at me. My mother mistook the silence for awe and pressed on, telling them about the valuation, the timeline, the fair 3-way split. I let her talk. I let her get all the way to the end of it. Every word in front of every witness. Then, when she finally turned to me with a benevolent smile and said, "Isn't that right, sweetheart?" I set down my coffee and stepped forward. "Actually, Mom," I said, and my voice came out level and clear and carried farther than I expected across that quiet lawn. "The ranch isn't yours to sell." She laughed, a small social laugh for the crowd. "Honey, this isn't the time. We'll do the paperwork privately." "We can do it right now," I said. "Harlan?" The man in the gray suit stepped forward, and I watched my mother's face register that the quiet mourner she'd ignored was holding a folio of his own. "I'm Harlan Pratt," he said. I was Earl's attorney for 20 years. He opened the folder and held up a single page with a county seal stamped at the bottom in red. This is a certified copy of the recorded deed for this property. Earl Sinclair transferred full ownership of the land, the buildings, and all water and mineral rights to Kinsley Sinclair. He paused. 3 years ago. It's been hers, free and clear, since then. There is nothing in the estate to sell. There is nothing to split. The silence that followed had a texture to it. Paula the realtor very slowly closed her leather folio. My father's mouth opened and shut. And my mother's face did something I had never once seen it do in 34 years. It cracked. The performance fell off it all at once, and underneath was something raw and ugly and, for just a second, almost frightened. That's not possible, she said. He was confused. He was sick. You manipulated a dying old man. He recorded it 3 years ago, Harlan said mildly. He drove to the county office himself. He was sharper than most men half his age. I looked at my mother and I did not feel the triumph I'd braced for. I felt something quieter and sadder. I felt the whole architecture of my childhood finally collapse in public, in daylight, with witnesses, exactly as I'd wanted. And there was no joy in it, only a clean and final closing. June lifted her head in the pasture at the rise in voices, then went back to grazing, unbothered. The throwaway mare on her unsellable land. I let the truth sit in the air a moment longer. Then I said the thing I'd waited 9 years to say, and I said it softly, because the soft ones land hardest. You always said you could only show up for one of us. Grandpa showed up for me. On paper. Permanently. Try and cancel that. That's when they came apart. All 3 of them. Exactly the way Earl said they would once they saw they'd lost. My mother went first and went loud. After everything I did for you, she shouted on my porch, in front of 40 years of my grandfather's friends. I raised you. I fed you. This is how you repay this family? Stealing your sister's inheritance? She was shaking, her finger out, her voice climbing into a register the neighbors had never heard from polished Sharon Sinclair. I just stood there. I didn't raise my voice to match hers. I'd learned, finally, that the calm one in a room full of shouting is the one everybody believes. Sloane went next, right on cue, switching from grief to a fresh crisis in under a breath. I can't believe this, she wailed, pressing a hand to her chest. I feel faint. I think I'm having an attack. Somebody. And for the first time in my life, nobody moved toward her. Not one person. The boarders looked away, embarrassed for her. The old reflex, the one that had canceled my whole childhood, found an empty room. And my father, my quiet father who'd kept the peace by sacrificing me at every turn, did the saddest thing of all. He stepped toward me, away from them, his eyes wet, and he said low, just for me, I should have come to your birthday, Kinsley. For 1 second my heart moved. Then he glanced back at my mother, and the spine went out of him the way it always had, and he stepped right back to her side. Near, sympathetic, unchanged. He'd had 34 years and 1 funeral to choose me, and even now, knowing everything, he chose her in the space of a single backward glance. That told me more than any deed could. My mother kept shouting about lawyers and contesting an undue influence. Harlan, unbothered, said she was welcome to try, that the recording was airtight, and the witnesses many. And I stood in the middle of all of it, the strong one, finally getting to be strong on my own terms. And I felt nothing I needed to act on. I just waited for them to run out of noise. When the shouting finally guttered out, because shouting always does when nobody feeds it, I spoke once more, quietly, and the whole porch went still to hear it. I'm not going to fight you in court, I said. You'd lose, and it would cost you money you don't have. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to get in your car, and you're going to drive back the 3 hours you came, and you're not going to call this ranch again. My mother started to speak. I didn't let her. For 34 years, I said, You told me I was the strong one, so you'd never have to give me anything. You canceled my birthday. You built a group chat to keep me out of my own family. You drove out here to sell the only home that ever wanted me, and you called it doing me a favor. I looked at the three of them, at the realtor, at the friends who'd loved my grandfather. You taught me family is whoever shows up, I said. None of you ever did. So I built one. Then I gestured, calm as anything, toward the long gravel drive. The gate's this way. And I walked them to it myself, the whole length of the drive, past the new barn and the full stalls and the mare nobody had wanted, my boots steady on ground that was mine. I didn't slam anything. I didn't need to. I just opened the gate and stood beside it and waited. They left the way people leave when they've lost and can't admit it, with the engine too loud and the gravel kicking up, and not one of them looking back. Paula the realtor pulled out first, embarrassed, with a small apologetic nod in my direction that I appreciated more than she knew. Then my mother's spotless sedan, with Sloane already on her phone in the back seat hunting for the next available sympathy, and my father in the passenger seat staring straight ahead at a road that led back to the same small house and the same small life I'd finally escaped. I stood at the open gate and watched the car shrink down the drive and turn onto the county road and disappear into the heat shimmer. I didn't feel like crying. I didn't feel like cheering. I just felt the quiet come back. The good quiet. The kind I'd driven 3 hours and worked 9 years to earn. Behind me, June lifted her head and nickered, low, the way she did when she wanted me back at the rail. So I closed the gate, slid the bolt home, and turned around to walk back toward my life. There was lunch to finish. There were horses to feed. There was a whole afternoon of being free. That was a little over a year ago. My mother had a lawyer send one letter threatening to contest the deed. Harlan sent one back, and we never heard from him again. Sloane called once, 6 months later, not to apologize but to ask for money, the way water finds the same crack every time. I told her no, kindly, and I hung up, and I didn't feel a thing afterward except the mild surprise of how light a clean no can be. I haven't spoken to my parents since the gate. I don't expect to. Some doors you close so the rest of the house can finally get warm. The ranch is thriving. The waiting list is 14 names now. Casey's 20 and running her own training clients. And last month I handed her a brand new pair of work gloves, stiff and pale, and told her they'd fit when she'd earned them, and watched her not understand yet exactly what I meant. She will. Tom and I got married in the spring, out by the arena, with the boarders and the neighbors and the horses looking on over the rail. It was small and honest, and nobody fainted. June had her third foal in April, a leggy filly I'm keeping, because some lines you protect once you understand their worth. And Earl's gloves still hang on the post by the tack room. I wear them every morning, the cracked brown leather soft at the knuckles. His father's before him, mine now, and they fit me perfectly. They have for years. I just didn't notice the day it happened, the same way I didn't notice the exact day I stopped waiting for a phone call from people who were never going to make it. Here's the only thing I know for sure now. Blood made us relatives, but it never once made us family. And the day I stopped begging the first to act like the second was the day I finally had room in my life for the people who simply showed up. That's my story. One canceled birthday, 9 years of work, and a gate I finally got to close on my own terms. If someone in your life keeps calling you the strong one to excuse leaving you out, let tonight be the nudge you needed. You're allowed to go build a table of your own. Share this with whoever needs to hear it. Drop a comment and hit subscribe. I'll see you in the next one.